Welcome to my study today. I'm going to look at two modal verbs, ought and should, and although I'm calling ought a modal verb, it can be followed by to, the to infinitive. I'll put a link below to the rules for all the other modal verbs. And there's an exercise to follow so you can practice. So, let's get started. We use ought to for giving advice to other people or even to ourselves, for an obligation, that's something we must do, and a duty. Look at the first example. You ought to take your umbrella, it's going to rain. That's good advice. Ought to can also be used for present or future conditions. I ought to write to John today, or I ought to write to John tomorrow. Both are okay. But if there's something in the past that I didn't actually do, and I begin the sentence with a past tense, I have to put it like this. I knew I ought to write to John, but I never did. I can talk about something specific in the past, which I didn't do, by using the present perfect to follow ought. I knew that I ought to have written to John last week, but actually I didn't. We can express the negative by putting the not between the ought and to. You oughtn't to be doing that. That's actually quite difficult to pronounce correctly. You oughtn't. You oughtn't be doing that. And if I want to say to somebody, look, you're behaving very badly here and I want to be polite, I would say, ought you to be doing that? I know perfectly well they shouldn't, but I don't want to upset them. Ought you to be doing that? They may well reply, well, actually I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to anyway, so stop worrying. Ought you to be doing that? Should is very similar to ought, but does behave slightly differently. I should be there before 6. I can use should in reported speech to replace shall. She said she should be there before 6. I can use it to make a prediction for the future. I should be in Paris tomorrow. And I can use it to give an opinion. I don't think I should work so hard. The poor old auntie's working hard, isn't he? The question form can be used to ask someone for advice. Should I get my hair cut? And when we didn't do something in the past, we used the should have done structure. Strangely, it's mostly in the negative form, like this. I shouldn't have eaten such a big dinner. In other words, something in the past I should not have done. A good question would be, which is the strongest, ought or should? But that's hard to answer because they are quite often interchangeable in English. However, in pronunciation there is a strong and weak form of should. Look at this example. People should vote in the election. That's quite strong and stressed. But sometimes it almost disappears. I should be so lucky. I should be so lucky. I'm almost saying I should, and that's a weak form. Ought more or less stays the same, but there is a slight pause between the T of ought and the T of to, if you listen for it. I ought to have been more careful. I ought to have been more careful. We can use another phrase to replace ought or should, and it's had better. And we use it when we want to suggest the wisest course of action. And it can be for the present or for the future. We had better call the doctor today. We had better call the doctor tomorrow. But in spoken English, we contract it. I'd, you'd, he'd, she'd, we'd, you'd, they'd better. You'd better call the doctor. We can use the negative form to make a question. Hadn't you better call the doctor? Notice that the not comes after had and goes before the subject you. An imperative with a negative tells you not to do something. You'd better not make a mistake, but this time the not comes after better. These are very useful constructions, and it makes you sound very English if you can get them right. So you'd better not make a mistake. You may be wondering how must compares with ought and should, and I think generally you can say it's stronger. Look at this example. I ought to, I should renew my TV license, but actually I'm not going to. But if I said I must renew it, I would have to do it because it's the law. So you can see how must is just that little bit stronger. You might see an exam paper, candidates should answer all the questions. It wouldn't really say candidates must answer all the questions. That's a little bit too strong. So firm advice, candidates should answer all the questions. Ought and should can be used with a continuous infinitive, like this. You ought to be studying. You shouldn't be wasting your time. But notice ought is followed by to, but shouldn't is not followed by to, because it's obeying the modal verb rules. The perfect infinitive is used for something in the past which was not completed. Like this. You should have told me the paint was wet, but you didn't. And you notice that the perfect infinitive here doesn't have the to because should is a modal verb. So, before we look at the exercises, could I ask you to subscribe below and hit that bell? 2 exercises here. Rewrite the sentences so that they refer to past time. And the second one, use should, shouldn't, must, ought, or had better to fill in the sentences. The answers follow. Next time we'll have a look at the special modal verb need, which can be followed by the to infinitive. So, thank you for watching. Please subscribe below and I'll see you next time. Bye!